It is the 23rd of June, 1915. The North Sea is gray and restless, and somewhere beneath its surface a German submarine prowls. The U-boat's commander peers through his periscope at what appears to be an old, weathered merchant vessel limping across the water, exactly the sort of defenseless target that has made him infamous across the British Isles. He gives the order to surface. The submarine breaks through, water cascading from its conning tower, and the crew hurries to man the deck gun. They have precious little ammunition for their torpedoes. Better to conserve them and destroy this ship with gunfire. The merchant vessel ahead seems to pay no attention, its crew apparently scrambling in panic. It is the perfect moment to strike, and then, in an instant, everything changes. The false panels along the merchant ship's rail drop away, revealing a carefully concealed arsenal of naval guns. The German sailors barely have time to react before the first shells rip into their vessel. Within minutes, it is over. U-40 sinks beneath the waves, the first victim of a weapon so secret, so improbable that it would remain classified for decades. This was no merchant ship. This was a Q-ship, a wolf in sheep's clothing, and the story of how Britain's desperate admiralty created them is a masterclass in tactical deception. By late 1914, the British Admiralty faced a crisis unlike anything in modern naval warfare. The German U-boat campaign had introduced a new and terrible form of maritime combat, one that rendered conventional naval superiority almost meaningless. A battleship, no matter how heavily armored, could not protect a merchant vessel. A cruiser could not be everywhere at once. The submarines operated with near impunity, surfacing to attack with their deck guns or firing precious torpedoes at point-blank range. The losses mounted with horrifying consistency. British merchant ships were sinking at a rate that threatened to strangle the nation's supply lines. Convoys had been suggested as a solution, but the Admiralty rejected the idea. They lacked the escort vessels. Independent ship captains refused to sail in slow convoys. The depth charges available at the time were crude and largely ineffective against submerged targets. It seemed impossible. How could you fight an enemy that could attack from beneath the water, disappear at will, and strike in any location across thousands of square miles of ocean? In December 1914, a handful of naval officers began thinking about the problem differently. They recognized a critical vulnerability in the U-boat tactics. A submarine commander, bound by international law and the rules of prize warfare, could not simply sink a merchant vessel without warning. He had to surface, demand the vessel's papers, ensure the crew had time to abandon ship, and only then open fire or dispatch a torpedo. This gave the British a window. A very small window, but a window nonetheless. And from this simple observation, this clarity of understanding born from desperation, a concept emerged. What if they took an old merchant ship, fitted it with concealed guns, and sent it out into the waters where U-boats hunted? What if they made it look like exactly the kind of vessel a submarine commander would want to attack? The logic was elegant in its simplicity. If a U-boat could be fooled into surfacing beside an armed warship disguised as a merchant vessel, it would be hopelessly outgunned at close range. By early 1915, the Admiralty had begun to implement this audacious plan. They scoured the British merchant fleet for suitable vessels. Old steamers, fishing trawlers, colliers, anything that looked appropriately defenseless. These were not newly constructed warships. They were converted merchant ships, stripped down, carefully modified and fitted with a deadly arsenal hidden behind removable wooden panels and false cargo. The work was carried out at naval dockyards scattered across Britain, with the greatest concentration at Holbow Line in Cork Harbour and Devonport. Workers labored in strict secrecy. Few understood the true purpose of the vessels they were modifying. The hiding places for the guns were masterpieces of deception. Naval guns, some mounting 6-pounder shells, others the heavier 4-pounder and 12-pounder varieties, were concealed behind false paneling that could be dropped away in seconds. Machine guns were tucked into sheds and behind wheelhouses. Ammunition was carefully distributed throughout the vessel in ways that would not alter its apparent center of gravity or trim. The ships had to look authentic. They flew neutral colors when necessary. They carried what appeared to be genuine merchant cargo. The crews wore shabby uniforms or even civilian clothes. They slouched about the decks as if indifferent to danger. Everything was designed to communicate weakness, vulnerability, and desperation. The operational concept relied on meticulous performance. When a U-boat was spotted on the horizon, the crew of a Q-ship would feign panic. Men would run about shouting as if the vessel was about to sink. A carefully rehearsed panic party would move toward the lifeboats. The ship would lose speed, appearing to be stricken. Some vessels even carried animals on deck, cattle that would be released to the water to enhance the impression of chaos. A wounded sail might be rigged clumsily. Smoke from the engines might be encouraged. Everything was theater, and the performance had to be flawless because the consequences of getting it wrong were absolute. If the deception failed and a U-boat fired a torpedo, the Q-ship would be exposed whilst still at close quarters with nowhere to run. The submarine, for all its limitations on the surface, was still a formidable opponent. The great advantage of the Q-ships lay entirely in surprise. Once that was lost, survival became a matter of chance and courage. Between 1915 and 1918, the British Royal Navy commissioned approximately 180 Q-ships. They were given ordinary-sounding names to maintain their cover: the Antwerp, the Prince Charles, the Barralong, the HMS Dunraven. They were crewed largely by Royal Navy personnel, though some were operated with civilian merchant crews reinforced by Navy gunners. The men who served aboard them volunteered for duty that they understood would be extraordinarily dangerous. There was no glory in it, no medals announced in the press, no public recognition. Their ships' actions remained classified. If they were killed, their families were told only that they had died in service to the Navy. The Q-ships operated in the waters where submarines were known to hunt: the Irish Sea, the English Channel, the waters around the British Isles, and out into the Atlantic approaches. The early successes were dramatic. On the 23rd of June 1915, the converted fishing trawler HMS C-24, cooperating with the merchant vessel Taranaki, successfully engaged and sank U-40, the first U-boat to fall to a Q-ship. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. German submarine commanders who had grown accustomed to approaching any merchant vessel with virtual impunity suddenly faced a new and terrifying possibility. Every cargo ship, every tramp steamer, every fishing vessel might be a trap. You could not know until you were close enough to die. In August 1915, the small converted fishing smack HM Armed Smack Inverlion, armed with nothing more than a 3-pounder gun and crewed by local fishermen, sank the submarine UB-4 in the North Sea with all hands lost. The vessel had been so small, so insignificant-looking, that the U-boat commander had deemed it not worth wasting a torpedo. His last decision on Earth proved to be his fatal one. If you are finding this fascinating, a quick subscribe would mean more to me than you know. These untold stories of British naval ingenuity deserve to be remembered. The operational accounts that survive from Q-ship engagements paint vivid pictures of extraordinary bravery and desperate action. The HMS Stock Force, commanded by Lieutenant Harold Outen, engaged the German submarine SMUB-32 on the 30th of July, 1918, in the English Channel. The U-boat fired a torpedo that struck the Stock Force's forward section, exploding with devastating force. Water poured into the vessel. The ship's bow began to rise as the stern sank. Yet Outen's crew worked with astonishing discipline, returning fire with every gun they could bring to bear. The U-boat, damaged and unable to submerge in the shallow channel waters, found itself trapped on the surface, pounded by the gunfire of the supposedly defenseless merchant ship. The U-boat sank. The Stock Force, mortally wounded but still firing, took hours to go under. Only when rescue vessels arrived did her crew finally abandon her, colors still flying defiantly. The HMS Dunraven, another Q ship that became legendary in naval annals, survived an encounter with UC-71 in August 1917 that was almost unbelievable in its ferocity. The U-boat fired a torpedo that struck the Dunraven's hull. The ship appeared to be sinking. Crew members staged panic parties, abandoning ship in what appeared to be genuine desperation. But the U-boat commander, growing suspicious of something he could not quite identify, surfaced and approached at close range, preparing to fire his deck gun to ensure the vessel sank. It was the moment the Dunraven's captain had been waiting for. The hidden guns erupted. The U-boat crash-dived, but not before sustaining serious damage. It surfaced again at point-blank range now and fired back. The battle continued in a desperate, close-quarter exchange of fire across barely 100 meters of open water. When it was finally over, UC-71 had escaped, but only barely, and the Dunraven was dying, hit by shell after shell, taking on water that would eventually send her to the bottom. The crew was rescued, and Captain Gordon Campbell was later awarded the Victoria Cross for his extraordinary leadership during the engagement. His first lieutenant, Geoffrey Hewitt, received the Victoria Cross as well. These were not men seeking glory. They were men facing death itself in the waters off the French coast, determined that their enemy would not sink their ship without a fight. Yet, for all their drama and courage, the strategic effectiveness of the Q-ships remains contested by naval historians even today. In total, during 4 years of operation, the Q-ships engaged enemy submarines on approximately 150 occasions. Of these engagements, they destroyed 14 U-boats. 14. The number seems almost impossibly small set against the scale of effort required to build and operate nearly 180 vessels. 61 Q-ships were sunk during the war. Some went down in engagements with submarines. Others were destroyed by torpedoes that found their mark before the deception could be revealed. Many more simply disappeared without trace, victims of bad luck or bad weather or enemy action that was never recorded or confirmed. The losses among the men were substantial. The psychological impact of the Q-ship program, however, was immeasurable. Every German submarine commander knew, after the first months of 1915, that he was no longer operating with impunity. Every merchant vessel became a potential threat. This knowledge cost time. It cost confidence. It made captains more cautious, more likely to use torpedoes rather than surface gun attacks, more inclined to attack and disappear rather than approach closely enough to secure proof of their kills. In this sense, the Q-ships may have saved far more ships than they sank U-boats. Compare this to the German response. The Kaiserliche Marine, the Imperial German Navy, understood the threat immediately. They attempted their own decoy vessels, but they never achieved the same success. The Germans lacked the same merchant fleet from which to draw suitable vessels. Their attempts at deception were less convincing, their crews sometimes less committed to the dangerous charade. The German Q-ships remained largely a minor tactical experiment, whereas the British Q-ship program became a major strategic initiative, consuming resources and forcing a modification in how the enemy conducted operations across the entire Atlantic. The American and Allied navies also attempted Q-ship operations during the Second World War, but by then German U-boat commanders had become wise to the deception. The concept, once so effective because of its novelty, had become predictable. Project LQ, as the American program was designated, achieved only limited success. 3 U-boats were sunk by American Q-ships, but at the cost of 2 of the vessels themselves. The innovation, brilliant in its simplicity, had run its course. The future of anti-submarine warfare lay with convoys, escorts, sonar, and ultimately with aircraft that could hunt submarines on and beneath the surface of the water. Yet the legacy of the Q-ships persisted far beyond their operational lifespan. They demonstrated that unconventional thinking could solve problems that seemed insurmountable within conventional frameworks. They showed that courage and discipline could triumph even in the face of overwhelming disadvantage. They proved that a small, seemingly defenseless vessel, if manned by determined and skilled sailors, could stand against far more powerful opponents. The Q-ships were not the ultimate solution to the U-boat menace. That would come later, through the introduction of convoy systems and the development of better detection and destruction methods. But they were a response at a moment when no good solutions seemed available. They were an answer improvised by the Admiralty when desperation demanded invention. Today, several Q-ships still survive in historical records and in the memory of naval enthusiasts around the world. The stories of the men who served aboard them have been documented, preserved, and studied by military historians. Their actions contributed to the ultimate victory against the German submarine threat, not through any single dramatic engagement, but through the cumulative effect of demonstrated threat, psychological impact, and tactical disruption across 4 years of total war. In the strategic calculus of the First World War, where every advantage, no matter how marginal, could shift the balance of a grinding, attrition-based conflict, the Q-ships occupied a curious but significant position. The question that historians continue to debate is straightforward. Were they worth it? The answer depends entirely on perspective. If measured purely by tonnage of enemy vessels destroyed relative to effort invested, the Q-ships appear as a marginal tactical success. 14 U-boats represents a fraction of the submarines that would eventually be sunk through mines, conventional naval action, and later through depth charge attacks. But if measured by the disruption they caused in enemy operations, the caution they instilled in German commanders, and the psychological boost they provided to a British maritime nation facing an existential threat to its supply lines, their value becomes harder to calculate and perhaps ultimately more significant than any simple accounting of enemy vessels sunk could capture. It is worth remembering that in December 1914, when naval officers first began suggesting the concept that would become the Q-ship, the U-boat seemed like an unstoppable weapon. It operated beneath the surface, beyond the reach of conventional naval defenses. It appeared in any location without warning and disappeared just as quickly. It was the perfect predator, and there seemed to be no adequate prey for it. Yet within a matter of weeks, the British Admiralty had conceived of a response. It was not a technological solution. It was not a more powerful weapon. It was simply the product of clear thinking about the enemy's vulnerabilities. A U-boat had to surface to attack merchant vessels in accordance with international law. That surfacing, that moment of exposure, was the window through which the Q-ships struck. The elegance of the solution lay in its simplicity, a ship that appeared to be what it was not. Deception wielded as a weapon, a merchant vessel that became a warship in the moment of combat. In the final years of the war, as better anti-submarine methods were developed and as German U-boat doctrine evolved to counter the Q-ship threat, the great decoy vessels gradually faded from active service. The last Q-ships were paid off in 1918 and 1919. Their crews dispersed, their secret service recognized quietly, if not celebrated publicly. Some of the vessels were simply returned to merchant service, sailing peacefully under civilian colors once again, as if their years of deception and danger had been merely an interlude in an ordinary life. Others were broken up for scrap. The Q-ships that sank U-boats became footnotes in naval history, their stories told in classified reports that remained inaccessible for decades after the war's end. Yet the men who served aboard them, the captains, the gun crews, the engine men, the ordinary sailors who maintained the deception day after day on the cold waters of the North Atlantic, those men knew what they had done. They had answered the impossible with courage and ingenuity. They had proven that a crew armed with nothing more than determination and wit could stand against the most advanced technology that the enemy could deploy. The Q-ships represented something fundamental about British naval tradition: the ability to adapt, to improvise, to think creatively when circumstances demanded it. When conventional weapons and conventional tactics proved inadequate, the Navy invented something entirely new. It was not the first time this would happen in naval history, nor would it be the last. But in the specific context of the First World War, facing an enemy that seemed to hold all the advantages, the creation of the Q-ships represented a response born of pure necessity and executed with extraordinary skill. By the time the First World War ended in November 1918, the U-boat threat had never been truly eliminated, merely contained and managed through a combination of tactics that eventually coalesced around convoy systems and improved anti-submarine weapons. The Q-ships had played their role, had drawn blood, had instilled caution, and had bought time for those more permanent solutions to be developed and deployed. 14 U-boats sunk may not have changed the course of the war in any measurable sense, but those 14 boats represented thousands of tonnage of enemy submarine capability removed from the war. Those 14 boats represented countless merchant vessels that survived, that continued to deliver the supplies and materials necessary for Britain to continue fighting. And those 14 boats represented the moment when British ingenuity and British courage combined to answer an apparently unanswerable challenge. The wolf in sheep's clothing had proven itself a worthy predator. In doing so, it had helped to ensure that the German wolves hunting beneath the surface would never again feel entirely confident or safe in British waters. And that, perhaps, was the true measure of the Q-ship's legacy. Not the tonnage sunk or the vessels destroyed, but the shift in the balance of psychological and tactical advantage that persisted right through to the final days of the war. When faced with an enemy that seemed unstoppable, the British did not surrender. They did not accept defeat. They thought clearly about the problem before them, identified a vulnerability, and exploited it with courage and discipline. The Q-ships were never intended to win the war. They were simply Britain's answer to an impossible question, and in the moment when that answer was given, 14 German U-boats learned exactly why that answer mattered.